Hi. One of the biggest fallouts of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis is the impact that it is having on employment globally. I have followed with particular interest the escalating unemployment in the United States. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, and the numbers will likely continue to grow before the economy begins to add jobs again. Many large U.S. companies like Boeing, the large airplane manufacturer, have announced cuts to staff and are planning to lay off many more people in the thousands. The U.S. is on course to reach levels unseen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Great Depression, as you know, was one of the most trying periods of American history, a period in which, like today, the economy collapsed and millions of people were forced into survival mode and had to line up for food at food banks. None of us would have imagined just a few months ago that the United States, the world's superpower, could ever return to such a state. And yet here we are. Those scenes are re-emerging in the form of massive lineups for emergency food assistance at virtually every state and every community in America. I recently watched in amazement news footage of some 6,000 cars lining up at a drive-through food bank in San Antonio, Texas. Some families arrived as much as 12 hours early just to make sure that they get some food. On their faces, I could see depression, anxiety, and fear. Fear of the unknown. As the world begins to grapple with the uncertainties brought about by the pandemic, America, like many other countries around the world, will be forced to reckon with its past. As you know, America is a divided country, divided on many levels, politically, religiously, ideologically, and unfortunately, racially. In its search for a pathway into the future, that great nation will come face to face with the structures and policies and warped perceptions that normalize economic injustice and institutionalize poverty for so many of its citizens. So, what does all this have to do with Africa? Well, just about everything. This is not the typical story of the haves and the have-nots. It's a story of those who had and today have not. It is not a new conversation for America, and I bring it up here only because I see such a strong correlation between the realities and perceptions of race and economics in America and the race factor, real and perceived, in Africa's economic journey with its Western partners. I'm very conscious of the fact that the subject of race is a touchy and sensitive topic that many people would rather not talk about. And so I find myself being cautious not to offend. But let me ask this question. When the American economic machinery begins to turn again, and I believe it will it turn for all of America? And if perchance the Black community will miss this train again, will it be that they were left by the train? Or will it be that they simply did not or could not get on the train? The truth is that poverty in America is so much more prevalent among Black Americans. A disproportionately high percentage of Black people in America are jobless. And the picture of inner city Black people lining up for food at food banks is a common one. In short, the public face of poverty in America is Black. So today, many working class and middle class white Americans who have never had to rely on charitable aid in their lives are facing an economic situation that for many is frightening. How is this reality going to change our perceptions about poverty and about the poor? I want to talk here about perception because what we perceive to be real is so powerful that it often overshadows reality itself. I am an African, and I am painfully aware of the negative self-perception that so many Black Africans carry around. It is a perception that severely cripples our ability to progress. Whether from forces of history or from years of repeated bombardment by the negative mass media, many Africans have adopted a self-image that feeds on itself and actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the other hand, I am equally aware that the perception or the lenses through which many non-Africans view Africa has contributed to Africa's problems. While not all white people are racists, we cannot deny that the negative perception about Africa or Black people in general has contributed to the burden of poverty and economic struggle that Black people all over the world carry. The 1960s was, for America, a turbulent period. This was the height of the civil rights movement, in which Black Americans literally fought for basic freedoms like the right to vote. In July 1967, in the face of race riots that were spreading across America, President Lyndon B. Johnson set up an 11-member commission to investigate the causes of the civil unrest. The following year, just 2 months before the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the commission released its exhaustive and devastating report, in which it says, and I quote, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal." It said that discrimination and segregation had long permeated American life, and they were now threatening the future of all Americans. Almost 4 decades later, here in Africa, former President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, in his memorable Two Nations speech, said that South Africa is a country divided into two nations: the relatively prosperous white nation and the Black, largely poor nation living under grossly underdeveloped conditions. Mr. Mbeki, who was then serving as the deputy president to Nelson Mandela, was asked whether he thought that South Africa was making the requisite progress towards achieving the objectives of nationhood. And his answer was an emphatic no. Underneath the forgiveness and the flag waving that characterized the Mandela era, there were certain structural truths that would have to be addressed. Poverty, he said, was one such truth, arguing that in South Africa, poverty clearly had a racial dimension. Institutionalized racism, whether in the United States or in South Africa or Zimbabwe or in Francophone West Africa, has had an undeniable impact in shaping the economic structures that continue to undermine Africa's development. I have come to believe that no amount of money thrown at Africa will solve Africa's problems until both the givers and the takers have a change of heart. Changing the heart of man is not a simple thing, but our hearts must change if our behavior is to become different. I believe that only God can change the heart of man and of nations. Yes, the God that is referenced in America's founding document, the Declaration of Independence, which says, and I quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And so, as the pandemic shakes the world and levels the economic playing field, flattening the economic curve for Blacks and whites alike, could this be the opportunity to change our ingrained perceptions and attitudes about each other, about poverty, about justice, about ourselves? As the late Wayne Dyer once said, if we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. I couldn't agree with him more, because it is when perception is reformed that a new reality is born.